Cheers, thanks. Between me and lunch, not a good place to be, so I'll be quick and painless. What I'm hoping to cover off in the next 30 minutes is essentially a business perspective. So for those are absolutely technology immersed, I'd like you just to switch your hat to if you were a CEO of a business or a CFO. What I'll be doing is focusing on inverting the pyramid of the organisation. In that sense, what I'm going to do is talk about cloud implementation from the easy to the hard. The easy bit is where it's commodity standalone application, which essentially requires no integration, through to the large end of town, which is where major enterprise instance with deep integration, a long-term view, and that's the scope. So I'm not going to talk about, we've put Gmail into a business and all of a sudden we're cloud. That's not what I'm going to be covering. So what first thing I want to do is cover off some practical issues from the organisational perspective. The first and foremost one from a business point of view is to be absolutely crystal clear what are the drivers behind your desire to move to cloud. Are they you need to do things quickly? Are they to do things cheaply? Do you have mergers and acquisitions underway? What's your business agenda? Also understand and accurately map the solution that you're considering to your legislated regulatory and compliance environment, and also get your policy settings correct. So you might have laws and governance statutes out there that you need to comply with, but what is your own internal company's policy setting? Do you say that the law is by default our minimum? Map to your potential client's regulatory environment. You've been sailing along, you've got your own public, private, whatever cloud operating, you've got all your clients out there, and you then manage to secure a major new client whose governance, security and privacy requirements are much higher than what you can provide. So you're taking that client on into your ecosystem. So what is your business model in that situation? Resolve the integration complexities. One of the key considerations with that is mapping the cost, because with integration with the cloud ecosystem, there's always going to be a solution out there that will be able to, we'll broker this or we'll bolt things together. So you need to understand that ecosystem with some certainty so you can provide some sort of future state cost assurances. Most importantly, given the noise and hype, and still probably a couple of years to run, but essentially the question is, what's your cloud ecosystem going to look like in a couple of years' time? So one thing I'd like to also talk about, we've touched on this but in a little bit more detail, is essentially the phenomenon of shadow IT. And I'll be giving maybe boards of companies a couple of salutary messages here, which hopefully we'll be taking on board. So first of all, the shift from a technology provider to a service broker should be the mission of modern enterprise IT divisions. This essentially extends the chain of scope of your IT division to that of an organisation within an organisation that provides multiple services. Recognize this, there needs to be a shift in the internal technical skills, and I'm talking about technical and managerial skills in the same breath, for internal IT departments. And I'm finding that in my mentoring practice, that is certainly becoming very visible and evident. Technology-enabled business service is probably the key thing, and also the service delivery through service value chains means that the weakest link phenomenon is pretty well evident. And I'll talk about in a second with the topic of due diligence. Identify inconsistencies in any of these security, privacy, regulatory compliance through your cloud provider's chain. You might be using software as a service that's sitting on a platform as a service which is sitting behind something else. How do you know that you have got a consistent policy for all of these through that entire ecosystem? Something to consider is for enterprise IT, and bear in mind I'm talking about organisations with deep dependency on IT, with high cost, high profile, etc. If you've got an operational engagement, alignment or structural problem with your IT, my counsel to organisations is to fix those first. If IT is your primary cost driver and sole cost driver, to essentially revisit your assumptions, because as I'll illustrate in a second, cloud is not necessarily by default the cheapest option. Do not use cloud as a metaphor for fixing IT. For many, many years, IT divisions in some businesses have been treated like corporate adolescents, never been able to grow up. And overnight, they're all of a sudden expected to miraculously deliver immense business value and transform themselves overnight. The reality is quite a painful journey for organisations, not only the IT divisions. Speak to CFOs, they also have sleepless nights over enterprise governance, so it's not limited to the IT ecosystem. Treat cloud as one key element, and one key element should probably be italicised in neon as part of your deliberate business strategy. One other thing as well is to talk about roles and accountabilities in the cloud, because this is a fundamental organisational issue. At the heart of it, we have a series of cloud reference architectures. NIST is one, National Institute of Standards and Technology, is part of the US Department of Commerce, I believe, and also IBM, and there's a range of others. But just to illustrate the point, be aware of the inconsistencies between these and work out what your individual, bear in mind we're talking about large enterprise and complex enterprise, what is your cloud reference architecture within your own business? In the instance where NIST has got two roles defined of cloud broker and cloud auditor, the ones are not defined in IBM. The one would presuppose that in the instance of IBM, it's not in their commercial or technical best interest to have a third-party brokerage provide any of the services that they wish to offer to you. So the point is that look at it with open eyes. Others include know where the exit is. Moving into the cloud is like flying a light aircraft. The metaphor's been used many times. It's really easy to get into. It can be a nightmare to get out of. I worked with an organisation last year to actually get them out of public cloud because they went in so quickly, so deeply, and found their costs were hemorrhaging, and they had audit and compliance issues. So this is a question of, due diligence is paramount, and I'll touch on that in a second. So over the lifespan of the system, and this is the broad system, so that whether it's on-premise or whatever, you need to understand, the organisations need to understand their requirements, volatility. Cost certainty of your cloud solution is important, as is whether the cloud provider's capability and function. When I was CEO at Ricoh, we had a lot of solutions coming down. I've got a couple of ex-colleagues, they're still friends though, sitting in the Ricoh, sitting down there. And they're mentioning to me that Google, for example, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, but Google, when they moved away from Google Desktop, a particular service offering or solution offering offered by the company was no longer valid. It just disappeared overnight. So if you were running a business which depended exclusively on an offering from a large kind of offer like Google, and they decide, well, it's not in our best interest, we're going to turn it off, what position does that put your business in? So when you're scoping a cloud agreement, you have to make sure that minimum functionality standards are guaranteed in wet ink. That's probably the key thing. Volatility in the environment is the norm. Organisations change. We're all subject to significant business pressures. Cost certainty is a big deal. To this end, if we look at a survey which was put out early this year based on information from last year from Information Week, which asked the question, how worried are you about potential runaway costs of clouds if cloud scales up inappropriately, irrespective of the cause? The pie chart says it all. The majority of respondents found that they had an upside cloud concern about cost. Moreover, when I wrote this article up after this was done under non-disclosure, so I'm not in a position to provide the details of the company, but a reasonable sized organisation in Australia went to market looking for an RFP for software as a service, and it is not a CRM, it's a kind of niche, kind of semi-niche area. A number of respondents were on-premise and a number of respondents were cloud, software as a service. So one of the respondents had both on-premise option as well as cloud. The 5-year TCO exercise basically showed that the software as a service was standout by far the most expensive on a 5-year TCO basis. That cost differential was so significant that the ability to deploy a number of full-time staff, it just kind of didn't make sense. Now, this is purely from a TCO cost point of view. The discussion of value, comparative value, etc., this is out of it. I'm just using to illustrate that one has to test the assumption, and that is more so in software as a service. The closer one gets to the metal, the easier it is. That in the majority of cases, it will probably be cheaper. But the end of the point is for enterprise, you have to test the assumption that it is. It also means that the software as a service, in particular pricing models, are probably going to undergo some evolution, because the $50 per month per user is not necessarily a scalable option if you've got 100,000 users. and one has to look at that sort of from a value proposition. So essentially be testing the assumption that cloud is always cheaper. Management by information or accurate information is probably a good idea in large to medium organisations, and the ability to, and I'll just flip back a sec, the ability to compare on-premise IT costs compared with a pay-as-you-go cost is probably one of the harder things for most enterprise IT divisions and or businesses to do, who typically have a P&L view of the IT costs, staff, fixed, utility, maintenance, etc. Convert all of that to a per user per month basis is no small task. So once you're able to convert that on a per user per month by application basis, you're then in a comparative situation to have a apples with apples discussion. So that's just one of the things that's worth. And the book that I've got as a complimentary copy, just for those that haven't picked it up at the front, I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. I just want to swing on to the Patriot Act. We've heard the P word a number of times. And to try and not drive a bus through it, but essentially just draw some analogies, which some of the previous speakers have actually mentioned earlier. The capability's been around for a while. There's nothing new. There's lots of bilateral agreements between countries. The US free trade agreements cover intellectual property and the specific chapters, and they can reach into any organisation if they need to and expedite legal proceedings. Interpol has been around long before long before cloud. Uses a Freudian slip there. The legal precedents of extraterritorial, you don't want to say extraterritorial jurisdiction. There's not a lot of case law around, and for those, I think there's various in the legal fraternity around. There are also some precedents which have been set in terms of some case law, in terms of Australian reaching out to organisations. Australia's Anti-Terrorism Act is very similar to that of the Patriot Act. The Australian Federal Police have the power to obtain information at their discretion, and they may give of notice to intent, but it's not mandated. So it seems to me very, very similar to the Patriot Act. The European Union is something to keep an eye on, because the European Union is adopting a unified approach to this whole issue of privacy. So anyone have any dealings with Europe as an organisation, have to operate within Europe? Okay, a couple. The 27 EU member states are looking to adopt a unified approach and moving towards a single law to sort of integrate that to allow efficient utilisation of effective technologies within the EU, and also to allow some sort of some safe harbour against the Patriot Act. To a case in point, Microsoft, and I think someone alluded not to this case specifically, but when you have data, the provider does not necessarily know where the data is. So even though there's a data centre in Dublin, British Aerospace is under the advice from the legal advisors elected not to proceed with the Microsoft offering. I want to touch on due diligence for a second, because this goes to the heart of transitioning to the cloud, and that's essentially how I've branded what I do in the cloud, and the cloud's only part of what I do. It's navigating through the cloud, and that I thought very carefully, had a few, not say bottles of red wine, but a few glasses of red wine to think about that, because it's about navigating from one end of the field to the other. The trick is to know where the IEDs and the mines are, because you have to get to that pot of gold at the other end with certainty. And we're dealing with organisations above a certain size. We're not dealing with the trivial Dropbox and Gmail. I'll trivialise, but we're not dealing in that league. So expect volatility. If we have true as a service utility computing, which we've heard before, why would we commit to the long term? Indeed, probably mostly in software as a service layer. There are exceptions to every rule. If we're enterprise, we're expected to sign a multi-year contract. Why do we need to do that? Lack of legal precedence is another thing. In terms of international jurisdictional case law within cloud, it's very thin on the ground. Legislative and regulatory maturity is another thing. Level of maturity and understanding regulators. I think, for example, Google do something and they kind of almost not run rings around, but all of a sudden everyone's up in arms because Google's done something. Because of their market dominance, they're in a position to almost call shots. So there's an asymmetry of action response in that. Your contract with the cloud provider, is it balanced? So research has been done for a lot of the particularly consumer and commodity type services. You sign your life away when you go to the public cloud. For the enterprise, it's quite a different issue. Is your internal, and typically I refer to internal legal counsel, your internal counsel that's used to contract law, are they fairly au fait with the subtleties and nuances with cloud? Because it does present some unique challenges. There are legal practices out there do have special practice, expertise in cloud, but certainly internal counsel in some organisations need to be educated. Perpetual due diligence versus ongoing due diligence is part of the other challenge as well. And that highlights the role in NIST, then their cloud reference architecture, which talks about the role of the cloud auditor. So what I want to do is a couple of takeaways, 5 key points for due diligence. And remember, this is just scraping the flakes off the top of the iceberg. This is by no means intending to be a detailed treatise of what to do. So the first thing I'd want to know as a large enterprise, or an enterprise is going to put your skin in the game, is what is the history, structure, ownership, funding model? Is it venture capital? Is it private equity? And you know what venture capital and private equity is like, tends to be quite impatient. And also the jurisdiction, legal jurisdiction of the cloud provider and the cloud provider's ecosystem, and also the provider's provider, because what's standing behind what you see. So what are the provider's operational practices, and are they auditable or opaque? Are there inconsistencies between the sales and marketing collateral? And this is where the kind of intent of what you're buying bears resemblance to the actual contract that you would sign. And in enterprise parlance, I'm talking about a wet ink contract. I'm not talking about a sort of click-through, I agree. Assess the market volatility. What's happening in the market? There's a lot of noise. There's all the entrants coming in. Not everyone's going to survive. Some are going to be consumed. Others are going to be, some others are going to die. Will the costs and barriers to taking and mounting legal action across international jurisdictions be absolutely prohibitive, which means you will not even do it? So these are considerations that you need to consider about. Moving on to the next one, which is making sense of the range of cloud standards. There's a lot of activity in forums, industry. We've had some the good info and this representation here from the CSA, who's doing some really good work, probably largely unrecognised, but nevertheless, I think there's a place for organisations like that to reach out into the business world and not necessarily be focused purely within the IT space. I'm not saying that is the case in the CSA, but move out of the IT duck pond and get engaged with the business. Have an awareness of these, because this is the ecosystem that is emerging around us. This is potentially a rising tide lifting all boats, but some boats may be leakier than others, so one needs to be a little bit more careful. There are emerging standards. 27001 and SSA 70, which is superseded by SSA 16. They're largely written before cloud hit the deck, and there's new standards emerging, and there's a few of them just listed there. So once again, it's a watching brief. Understand what it means to your business. So in the 1 minute and 47 seconds I have left, I'm going to quickly whiz on to standards are a prerequisite for any shift to utility service. If we talk about software as a service, infrastructure as a service or whatever, interoperability, being able to pick up your business critical infrastructure applications and port it to someone else